the kind of anti-Zionism that we hear today, that dominates the discourse today on the left, very much relies on the tropes and ideas of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory as laid out in the Protocols of Zion. Welcome to Israel Unveiled. My name is Sandy Wezowicz, and I'm the Israel Education Director for Aglow International. A number of years ago, I took a group of intercessors to Washington, D.C. We were planning to meet with other prayer leaders and intercessors to pray over the city. We had some free time, so I decided to take my group to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And while we were there, I noticed that there was a special limited exhibition on the diabolical Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It's often referred to as just the Protocols of Zion. I realized that probably many in my group had never heard of it, even though it is described as the most notorious and successful work of modern anti-Semitism. So I decided that we would take the extra time, and actually walk through that exhibit. It would be used by the Nazis, the Protocols of Zion, to justify their goal of annihilation of the Jews. It would be used in present-day Islamists as one of their justifications for the annihilation of the State of Israel. And sadly, it's the basis for many for their hatred of the Jewish people. Several years after that D.C. trip, the Anti-Defamation League declared in 2021 that was the highest year on record of documented reports of harassment, vandalism, and violence directed at Jewish people. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about that diabolical doctrine. Where did and under what circumstances did the Protocols of Zion come about? Well, from 1791 to 1917, which was the end of World War I, 5 million Jews were faced with systematic persecution. They were limited in living in designated areas in Tsarist Russia. It was actually called the Pale of Settlement. And there's been a long history of anti-Semitism in Russia, particularly in that period of time. Often there were pogroms. Pogroms were violent and anti-Jewish riots that were actually encouraged by the Russian authorities. Why? Well, in Russia, there was a massive gap between those who were wealthy and the masses of the peasants. And the peasants lived in a system that left them impoverished, with low wages, terrible working conditions, and terrible living conditions. And so you can imagine unrest developed, labor strikes happened, and it was the beginning of the demand for reforms. So as the growing hatred against Tsar Nicholas II grew, he looked for a scapegoat to be able to deflect the anger of the peasants away from him. And so the answer? The Jews. He wanted to portray them as the reason for all of their problems. Joseph Goebbels, who was the Nazi propaganda minister, has often been quoted as having said, "A lie told often enough becomes a new truth." So Nicholas had a group of Russian Secret Service police, they were called the Okhrana, announced that they had suddenly uncovered secret meetings, the minutes of secret meetings between influential Jews. And it was all about how they would take over the world through a secret world Jewish government. He had the Russian government release this false doctrine called the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. Protocols were supposedly the 24 steps that would be taken to take over the world. And he had it released to the public. And people began to believe the lie. And of course, it fed the anti-Semitism. The first printing of it was in 1897 in Russia, and it was followed by a serialized version of it in 1903 that went across the country. In 1920, the protocols were printed in England, in the United States, in Japan, and France. And actually, when it was printed in Great Britain, it sold out immediately, and they reprinted it 5 more times. Now, the lie came to the United States through Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Corporation. He was, sadly, a rabid anti-Semite. The Times of Israel in 2020, on September 2nd, wrote this in an article, that by 1920, Ford had Americanized the forged document as, he called it, the international Jew, the world's foremost problem. And he ran it in his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, for 91 straight weeks. And the international Jew was translated into 16 different languages. Ford would go on to hand out over 500,000 copies to everyone who purchased a Ford automobile. The Jewish community in the United States mounted a lawsuit against Henry Ford, and he was eventually forced to retract his writings in 1927, but by then, his malignant views had already made its mark into the minds of many Americans. Anti-Semitism came into the American scene once again in the next decade through a priest, Father Charles Coughlin. He was from Detroit, and he is considered one of the most influential persons of his day. In 1938, his newspaper, Social Justice, serialized the Protocols of Zion. He promoted his anti-Semitic views through his radio, and that radio broadcast reached millions of people across America. Eventually, the Catholic Church and the FBI intervened, and by 1942, he was shut down. But sadly, Henry Ford and Father Coughlin made anti-Semitism go mainstream. The belief in the protocols of the learned elders of Zion continued in the 70s and 80s, and Hamas, which was an outgrowth of the parent organization Muslim Brotherhood, in its Hamas charter that was signed in 1987, justified calls for the annihilation of Jews and of Israel, partially using the protocols. In 1985, the Protocols of Zion were printed in English for Iran, in Farsi just 15 years later. In 2003, Al-Shatat television program called Al-Shatat, 29 episodes of a multi-million-dollar TV series. It was created in Syria, and it presented a story of the Jews wanting to rule the world. I remember previewing some of those episodes on the internet, and one of the most graphic scenes showed a kidnapped Christian boy having his jugular cut and his blood poured out, after which the Jews were portrayed as enjoying matzah that was made with his blood. And all of this aired during Ramadan. In 2005, Syria claimed that 9/11 was coordinated by the Elders of Zion. In February 7th, on 2019, there was an article that I read. It was by a Jordanian writer, Awad al-Sakr, and he wrote this, that the protocols of the Elders of Zion, written by the leaders of the Zionist movement, set out strategic plans for taking over the world, which Israel has been implementing by spreading chaos, wars, and corruption, and presenting any criticism as anti-Semitism. And he added that this is only the tip of the iceberg, and what is unknown about the protocols, he said, is even graver and more dangerous. In 2024, the United States State Department reported that the protocols still has a great influence in Russia, which continues to promote a hatred toward the Jews. Today, the state of Israel and the Zionist movement are still viewed by people throughout the world as part of a plan of world dominance by Jews, that the same idea that was presented in the protocols. There's another horrific lie that often works and is preceded by the protocols of Zion, and that's something called blood libels. In 1141 in Norwich, England, Jews were accused of having kidnapped, tortured, and crucified a Christian. Then they were said to have used his blood in preparation of matzah for Passover. Those Jews who were innocently charged and found guilty were massacred, and their money and belongings were taken by the church. In 1173, the lie made its first appearance in Europe, when a false accusation of blood libels resulted in the destruction of the Jewish community of Blois, France. This lie continues to resurface. In the May 2013 edition of Israel Today reported that the Lebanese newspaper Al-Sharq reported the following, and I'm reading it. During the Jewish holiday of Passover, strange and bizarre rituals are held according to instructions in the Talmud. The Zionists eat unleavened bread, which during its preparation is mixed with blood. But the blood must be from a non-Jew. And it ends with this. How can the world expect us to negotiate with people who crave the blood of human beings, not only in their wars, but even in their holidays? You know, I was actually watching CNN one evening back in August of 2014, and I actually heard Hamas spokesman Osama Hamadan in an interview, and he said that the Jews use Christian blood to make matzah. He said, it's a fact acknowledged by their own books and historical evidence. You know, the lie of blood libels that was rooted in medieval Europe has been used throughout history to justify persecution of Jews. July 2018, a United Kingdom labor official was forced to finally admit that anti-Semitic posts on his Facebook page were his. He first claimed that his Facebook page had been hacked, and he had written that it is a Jewish ritual to drink blood, and he wrote about other grossly obscene comments of what Jews do to babies. He was found out, and he resigned. Today, claims of Jewish worldwide conspiracy that is promoted. It's promoted not only through Middle Eastern television, but it's also promoted by government leaders and politicians. And also, it's embraced in varying degrees by many people in the West. And the claims of blood libel as well. And both continue to feed anti-Semitism. My eyes were opened with a video clip that I happened to watch on the internet 20 years ago. And for me, this really was an epiphany. And it was by Mark Levin, an American independent film producer. And shortly after 9/11 attack of the World Trade Center in New York City, he was actually traveling in the city not long after in a cab. And the Egyptian taxi driver happened to comment that, no Jews died in the World Trade Center. They were warned in advance. They all stayed home that day. Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. So he said, "You don't actually believe that?" And with great authority, the driver responded, "Yes, it was all written 100 years ago in the book." And when Levin questioned about the book, he answered, "The Protocols of Zion." It was after watching that clip that I knew I had to learn more about the Protocols of Zion. And what I learned literally opened up my eyes. And then not long after that, I was on a vacation in Florida, and I went to a major discount store chain and to pick up some toiletries that I had forgotten to bring home, to bring with me from home. And as I was about to check out, I noticed a rounder with books on it. I love to read, so I thought, well, maybe there's something I can pick up and I'll read on vacation. And what I found was a copy of the Protocols of Zion. And it reminded me that old lies have now circled back. In 2023, at a symposium at Georgetown University, the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, 120 years of anti-Semitic propaganda, was the title of that symposium. One of the guest panelists, Isabella Tabarovsky, said this: "We often hear that anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are not the same. In principle, they don't have to be. But in practice, and this is what history teaches us, most of the time, they are. They are the same in the most critical way possible because both lead to anti-Semitic outcomes for Jews. There is a reason for that," she said. "And the reason is that the kind of anti-Zionism that we hear today, that dominates the discourse today on the left, very much relies on the tropes and ideas of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory as laid out in the Protocols of Zion." Anti-Semitism is on the rise. You know, it's really important in this day that we're living that we stay informed. Too many people believe with conviction this false claim of a global Jewish conspiracy. And often its companion, blood libels. We've got to walk with eyes opened and truth on our lips. You know, we remember, as Christians, we know that we're not battling with flesh and blood. We're dealing with deceiving spirits. And we overcome with truth. And truth is our greatest weapon. I hope this podcast has been enlightening to you and been a help to you into understanding some of the things that we're hearing more and more in our day. And if it has been a help, I hope that you will click like and post. Be blessed and shalom.